Hi, I'm Dr. Michael Bitzer. I'm a professor of politics and history at Catawba College, and I also direct the Center for North Carolina Politics and Public Service. And in this video, I want to present some of the preliminary findings from a June 2025 Catawba-YouGov survey. Now, this particular survey was of 1,000 North Carolinians adjusted for weight, and you can find that information on the website that I'll be presenting in just a moment. But we conducted this survey from June 10th through the 25th, and it was paid for by the Center for North Carolina Politics and Public Service and was conducted online by YouGov. Now, the margin of error is about 3.5%. Now, in some of the subgroups that I'll be presenting from the demographic and other characteristics of North Carolina, those margins of error will be higher. But just as a baseline, 3.5% margin of error, meaning that for any results that we find, the numbers could actually be 3.5 points higher or 3.5 points lower for each of the findings. And it's important to remember that with all survey results, they should be seen as informative and not necessarily determinative. Now, in this QR code, which appears at the bottom here, you can scan that and go to the press release that the college has sent out about the survey and find much more details and other results in this particular survey. Now, for this survey, we asked a number of questions about particularly public elected officials' approval and disapproval among North Carolinians. This particular video will be focused on President Donald Trump's approval and disapproval. But we also released findings regarding U.S. Senator Thom Tillis, North Carolina Governor Josh Stein, and former North Carolina Governor and potential U.S. Senate candidate Roy Cooper. In addition, I'll be presenting President Trump's approval and disapproval numbers based on a number of demographics and other factors of interest here in North Carolina related to its politics. And particularly, this is important to note that the survey was completed before Senator Tillis on June 30th announced that he would not be seeking re-election to the U.S. Senate. This has been kind of the major news story in North Carolina politics over the past couple of days, and certainly would be reflective in future surveys that we do of North Carolinians. Now, in thinking about just the basic dynamics of North Carolina's public opinion regarding the approval or disapproval of President Trump, what we found overall was that President Trump's approval rating was at 46%, his disapproval was at 50%. Now, in our March survey that we did, we found the president with a 48 to 47 split. So here we're seeing a slight decrease and a slight increase in terms of the approval decreasing, the disapproval increasing for the president overall in North Carolina. But when you break it down by partisan identification, this has become very much the norm in North Carolina politics, as well as being kind of the norm in national politics. And you'll see this trend play out in the next set of bar graphs. For those folks who identified as Democratic in their partisan self-identification, they had nearly 9 out of 10 North Carolina Democrats disapproved of the president's performance, or him being president. Among those who identified as independents, 59% disapproved to 36% approved. And then when you asked self-identified Republicans what their approval or disapproval of the president was, 92% approved, 6% disapproved. So in North Carolina, it is very much a tale of a polarized electorate, particularly for folks who self-identify with one of the two major political parties. Democrats, not surprisingly, overwhelmingly against the president. Republicans, overwhelmingly for the president. Oftentimes it's the independents and the folks in the middle that make or break in North Carolina elections, and at this point in time, nearly 6 out of 10 independents disapprove of President Trump. Now, in looking at other factors, we can look at race and ethnicity. Here, in this particular set of graphs, I break it out into 3 distinct groups: white non-Hispanic respondents, black non-Hispanic respondents, and then combine both Hispanics, which could be of any race, along with all other racial identities. Among white non-Hispanics, more approve of the president than disapprove, 57 to 40. But among black North Carolinian respondents, it was overwhelmingly, almost 3/4, disapproved of the president's performance. Less than 2 out of 10 approved. And among all other ethnicities, Hispanics, along with all other races, 61% disapprove, 36% approve. When we look at the gender dynamic, and oftentimes when we talk about particularly elections, we talk about this factor known as the gender gap. We're seeing this play out in this survey as well. Again, the overall 50 to 46 disapproval to approval. Among males, it's 54-43, almost the inverse of the overall population. But among women, President Trump rates a 57% disapproval to 39% approval. And so you see a very clear gender gap dynamic at play within these results. In thinking about ideology, here we combine liberal and very liberal, and also combine conservative and very conservative. So we basically have a 3-point self-ideological identification categories going on. And among the liberals, the very liberals in this survey among North Carolinians, not surprisingly, 87% disapprove of the president. Among the moderates, 58 disapprove, 37 approve. But among conservatives and very conservatives, 86% approve, 12% disapprove. And so it's fascinating to me, kind of the mirror opposite images of the liberals versus conservatives. But among the moderates, there seems to be a pattern of more disapprove than approve. When we look at education, many have noted that there is a growing diploma divide. Just as there is with a gender gap, there is the diploma divide. And here I divided up the respondents into, again, 3 categories: a group of no high school graduate or high school graduate, some college or a 2-year college degree, and then 4-year graduates or postgraduates. And within this education dynamic of North Carolina, we see a very even split among high school educated respondents. Among those who have some college education, a slight approval over disapproval. But once you get into the college graduates and those with graduate degrees, much more of a disapproval, 58 to 40%. In looking at generational cohorts, again dividing up the pool of survey respondents into 3 groups: those that are the greatest or the silent or the boomer generation, basically anyone born before 1964, Gen X, 1965 to 1980, and then millennials and now Gen Z, those folks born after 1981. Here within the oldest generation, a slight advantage, but well within the margin of error for presidential approval. Among Gen X, kind of a reverse. Within, again, the margin of error, 50 to 45 disapproval. Among the youngest voters, those folks basically under the age of 45, we see much more: 52 disapprove, 44 approve. In thinking about regionalism, North Carolina is very much like the nation as a whole. There is an urban rural divide, but also very much the play of suburban areas. And here I think about suburban North Carolina as really two distinct factors. You have your central cities, so areas like Charlotte, Raleigh, Asheville, Fayetteville. You then have the urban suburbs, those areas inside an urban county, like Wake County, but outside the city of Raleigh, outside the city of Charlotte in Mecklenburg. You then go to the surrounding suburban counties, those areas around and integrated into that urban county. And then finally, rural counties. And not surprisingly, within the central cities, the big urban areas, President Trump has a really significant disapproval rating, nearly 2-to-1 disapproval within the central cities. Within the urban suburbs, a much closer divide, but still slightly more disapproval than approval. When you get into the surrounding suburban counties and rural counties, which typically tend to be the most Republican areas of the state of North Carolina, we see the president with a 58% approval rating in those surrounding suburban counties and a 53% approval rating within rural North Carolina. In terms of thinking about how these respondents voted in last year's presidential election, I looked at three distinct categories. Those who identified voting for Harris, the Democratic candidate, for Trump, the Republican candidate, and then we had a pretty significant group of respondents who said that they didn't vote in last year's election. Not surprisingly, those folks who said they voted for Harris for president, 94% of them disapprove of the president. Not surprising in terms of our polarized politics. For those folks who said they voted for Donald Trump, 92% of them approve of the president. Again, not surprising. For those folks who said that they did not vote in last year's election, 55% disapprove of the president, 31% approve, with about 14% saying they don't know. So this is an interesting pattern that we'll be watching over time going into next year's midterm elections, how this is playing out, particularly among these various voting bloc groups. Into the future, we're going to have different releases on more information and findings from this June YouGov Catawba survey. One set of releases that we'll make is on confidence in President Trump's handling of various policy questions, particularly questions related to the Middle East. We'll also have a release on North Carolinians' opinions on the importance of key characteristics about America's unique form of government. This is an area that I've been very interested to kind of get the public's reaction about. How do they feel about checks and balances, the separation of powers, these kinds of issues that are kind of fundamental to our form of government. We'll have a release on those findings in the next few weeks as well. You can also join the Center for North Carolina Politics and Public Services email list, where we will be sending out announcements about different activities, some articles of interest. If you're interested in joining that email list, you can send an email to politics@catawba.edu, and we'll sign you up for our distribution list. Thanks very much for watching this video about the June 2025 Catawba-YouGov survey.